kblbook.sqlite file. This is an SQLite database. SQLite is a simple file-based, non-authenticated database, and we use it here because it's easy to export to other machines. It's just a file and doesn't require a password, and yet it behaves like all other databases. It's a nice example database to use here. Knime has a full database category in the node repository to deal with all the operations on databases, reading, writing, connector, and so on. Let's focus on reading data from a database. There is not just one way to read data from a database in the Knime Analytics platform. Many ways are possible depending on how we want to process the data afterwards. So let's check the first approach, which is to collect the data directly from the database into Knime. So let's start from a connector, and let's use in this case an SQLite connector because we are dealing with an SQLite database. Let's open the configuration window. SQLite is a file-based database, so we only need the path to the file, a few more settings about the time zone corrections, and a few additional settings about how to deal with special column names and metadata. Okay. Do you notice the output port of this node? This output port is a red square. That means a database connection. So the SQLite connector just establishes a connection to the SQLite database in its configuration window. If I right-click and open the last option in the context menu of this node, after execution, I see all the settings used to establish this connection. Now, SQLite doesn't need a password, doesn't need authentication. However, if you are working with a database that needs authentication, you can define a workflow credential at the workflow level. Select the workflow in the Knime Explorer, right-click, select Workflow Credentials, and then create your workflow credentials. Give it an identifier, so for example, course credential. Then use your login, test user, and then the password for your login to the database. And now you say OK, and you have created a workflow credential for this database. OK. If you, for example, want to use a PostgreSQL connector, then if you open the configuration window, you are required to give the host name, the database name, the port, and then you are required to give the credentials to access the database. You can, of course, just give username and password, but this option is not very secure. In fact, username and password so provided will not be encrypted during the workflow execution. Alternatively, you can enable this Use Credentials option, and then in this menu, you are going to see all the credentials that have been created for this particular workflow. This is the one that we created before, we selected. So this is how you would deal with credentials for a database that requires credentials. Okay, but let's go back to our SQLite database. After the SQLite connector, you can use a database reader. Okay, the database reader takes optionally a connection to a database as input and produces data into the Knime Analytics platform as output. The black triangle means data into the Knime Analytics platform. Let's open the configuration window. The configuration window is just a SQL query to extract the data. I don't know anything about this database. I have no idea. This table is just a placeholder. I have to replace it with the real name of the table. So I use this Fetch Metadata button. The Fetch Metadata produces a view of what the database contains. In this case, it contains the KBL book table and a number of attributes fields in this KBL book table. So let's change the placeholder from table to KBL book with a double click. And let's extract, for example, only the sepal length instead of all possible fields from the table. Okay? So this is my final SQL query. It's good. I say OK. So I then execute it, and then let's check the output. And as output, you can see that my connection plus SQL query has produced the sepal length extracted from the database into the Knime Analytics platform. But that's not the only way to extract data from a database. Another way still requires a connector. So let's use the copy of the connector that we used before. And this time, instead of using the database reader, let's use the database table selector node here. The database table selector node requires a database connection as input and produces a SQL query as output. The SQL query is indicated by this brown square. So let's open the configuration window, and you can see that the configuration window is the same as the database reader node. So in this case, again, we use the fetch metadata to see what the database contains. We override this placeholder with the real name of the database. We limit the extraction of the data to the SEPA length field only. Okay, and now I execute the whole workflow. And now I can see that while the operations are the same, the SQL query is the same, the connection is the same, the output is different because the nodes produce different outputs. So let's see what the output of this database table selector node is. First of all, there is only a table preview, so there are no data extracted into Knime, but I can see what would be extracted if I were to execute the SQL query. I get only a preview of the first 100 rows, or how many I decide to see. And then here I see the full connection parameters. So the database URL, the database type, the driver, and especially the SQL statement that I've used. This button allows to copy this SQL query to the clipboard and maybe use it in another SQL editor. So the difference between these two is only in the output data. Here I have data, here I have a SQL query. This node here is only the beginning in database processing, and we will see how to run